Good evening. So sport has historically been a place that's pretty hostile toward individuals who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, or I'll use LGBT for short. 47% of LGBT youth are 47% less likely to engage in sport than their heterosexual peers, largely because of the abuse that they have either experienced or anticipate experiencing. When we talk to coaches and administrators who are LGBT, they report facing limited access to jobs and treatment discrimination in the workplace. So this has led some people to suggest that sport is a place that is normative for sexual prejudice and discrimination. It's the way things are done. But just because things are done commonly in a certain setting doesn't mean that everybody follows that path. We know, for example, that some sport organizations offer diverse and inclusive environments. And by inclusion, I mean that you can express identities that are important to you, what makes you different from everybody else, and at the same time, feel a sense of belongingness to that workplace. So for the last 8 years, my colleagues and I have sought to understand what's the effect of diversity and inclusion in sport? How do those organizations make it work? And why do the outcomes materialize? So we started with a couple of large-scale studies of athletic departments. In the first study, we looked at objective measures of performance, wins and losses for the athletic department. We found that diversity and inclusion along the lines of LGBT employees and employment practices led to far better gains in terms of performance measures. In some cases, the differences were sevenfold. In another study, we found that athletic departments that were diverse and inclusive, again along the lines of LGBT inclusion, had more creative workplaces than their peers. So this began to paint some of the picture. We see that diversity and inclusion is related to performance, and it could be because it relates to a more creative workspace. We then followed these up with a number of experiments, and I'll highlight 2 of them. In the first one, we asked job seekers to look at different organizations. Some were inclusive, some were not. Some were set in sport, some were not. The job seekers were from the South and from the Northeast. What we found was that people across the board really sought after and were attracted to those organizations that promoted diversity and inclusion along the lines of sexual orientation and gender identity. And this was important because there was no negative effects of those inclusive statements. It only, for some people, led to more attraction, more desire to work at that workplace, but it didn't necessarily deter others. We followed that up with another experiment, this one set in the fitness context. We asked people to review the brochure for a new fitness club. It included things like the name of the club, when it was going to open, how much they would have to pay for their membership, the amenities. And one of the brochures included at the bottom a rainbow flag and a statement that they were inclusive based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Those clubs, the ones that included that inclusive statement, were preferred over other clubs. And it was because people took that inclusiveness as a signal of a larger embracement of diversity, not just along the lines of sexual orientation and gender identity, but along the lines of race and gender and age. So that signaling of LGBT inclusion was actually a signal to broader diversity as well. So this painted a good picture for us. We then wanted to follow this up to see, well, how does this work? So we conducted what's called a collective case study. We went to organizations that we knew were diverse and inclusive. We spent time there. We examined their policies and procedures. We interviewed people, including coaches and athletes and administrators. And what we found was it took a concerted effort across a number of domains to create diverse and inclusive workplaces. At the individual level, it means that people interact with those who are different from them and are willing to engage in difficult dialogues. difficult conversations with one another. Leaders also made a difference. They openly advocated for diversity and inclusion, sometimes at the national level, and they also modeled what that looked like. At the organizational level, education took place, training took place, and it was repeated over and over, so it wasn't a one-time event. And finally, policies and procedures were adapted to ensure a diverse and inclusive workplace. So what does this tell us? I suggest three things. One, it's important from a research standpoint to not take the taken for granted, to not make the assumption that just because something is always the case, or that people say that it's common, that should be taken for granted. Instead, flip that on its head. That's what we found value in doing. We also saw that diversity and inclusion along the lines of sexual orientation and gender identity led to benefits, creativity, performance gains, people attracted to the workplace. And the third takeaway is that's really probably the last reason we ought to care about diversity and inclusion. We are in the people business, and we found over and over again that diverse and inclusive organizations, people were able to bring their whole selves to work. They didn't have to hide their identities. They could be who they were. That is a reason to embrace diversity and inclusion. The performance gains are just the cherry on top. Thank you very much.